all of you, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts about documenting birds in the age of digital technology. I like finding and photographing rarities and life birds as much as anyone, but that's not what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Instead, I'm going to be talking about the value of repeatedly documenting the same bird over and over and over again during the course of many weeks to months to even years. Variety is the spice of life, they say, and I've found that long-term study of the same individual permits us to see variation that we might not otherwise appreciate. Instead of variation among individuals, I'm talking about how one bird changes through time. I'm going to do this by sharing with you some photos and, in one case study, audio of 3 birds I got to study over the course of at least an entire season. They're 3 rather different birds, a merganser, a sparrow, and a hawk, so the particular lessons aren't the same. But some of the major lessons are broadly convergent, and I hope to bring out those generalities as we go forward. Let's get underway. I'm going to start off with some observations of a hooded merganser, a species that must be one of the most photogenic and most photographed of all birds in the US and Canada, like this one, which I photographed in downtown Denver late last year. I believe that this is a first-year male because of its all-dark bill, and I like how it is intense and determined looking. But it is, of course, the adult males, in particular the drakes, that attract the attention of so many photographers. Now, instead of showing you an especially stunning drake, I'm going to show you this guy, a rather ordinary-looking male on May 31st. Because of the relatively late date in the season, the sighting tripped the eBird filter. So we uploaded the photo to document the record for eBird. The bird continued at the pond by our house, and on June 10th, it looked like this. The crest is flattened now, and you can see a few dark flecks among the white feathering on the crown. The breast is blurry and smudgy, not what we expect from a sparkling drake in late winter or early spring. Our merganser is evidently beginning its summer molt. Scarcely a week later, on June 19th, the bird looked like this. Talk about having a bad hair day. Next up, if there's one constant with hooded mergansers, it's their addiction to crayfish. We've noticed that the local distribution of hooded mergansers in and around Boulder County is clearly connected with the availability of the virile crayfish, Faxonius virilis. Anyhow, the date is June 24th now, and the only contrast remaining on our merganser involves the wing feathers, as I think you'll see more clearly on this next image, only 24 hours later on June 25th. Those dark feathers, long and pointed with the white center stripes, are technically the tertials, the name given to the innermost flight feathers. They're held over or retained from the bird's brilliant winter plumage, but almost every other feather on this bird is one of its new summer plumes. My family and I went on vacation for a little while around this time, but when we came back, the male hooded merganser was still there, and now he looked like this. The body structure is that of a merganser, but I wonder if this bird could actually be identified by plumage alone. Even the tertials have dropped. I mean, I've seen juvenile blackbirds and starlings that look basically identical, if we're talking about only the feathers. In less than a month, the bird has gone from a basically normal, if somewhat muted drake merganser to something very few of us have ever laid eyes on. Why is that? After all, people go birding in summer, don't they? From what I can gather, encounters with male hooded mergansers in their full-on summer plumage are rare indeed. I'm aware of the general phenomenon that male mergansers go into hiding for a while in the summer months, and molt expert Peter Pyle has shared with us his conjecture that hooded mergansers go somewhere to perform a molt migration, perhaps in remote boreal bogs. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time somebody has formally documented the progression of the summer molt of the hooded merganser. On the one hand, that seems borderline preposterous. The species is, as we all know, beloved by photographers. On the other hand, photos of males in midsummer are rare, and dedicated photographic study of a known individual in its summer molt must be rarer still. As far as I'm aware, it has never been attempted until now. This is yet another one of those examples of how new and emerging technologies are affecting the way we engage and understand nature. The phenomenon of molt migration was formally announced by Finn Salomonsen in a technical journal out of Europe in 1968. But I think it's fair to say that the idea was slow to catch on over here on this side of the pond, at least initially. Digital photography is changing that. The sort of study I've presented here could, in theory, have been conducted by anybody with a film camera in 1968, but in practice, probably not. Who would waste all that precious film on something as boring as a messed up molting merganser? And Peter tells us that the same neglect evidently applied to the museum collectors of yesteryear. In the 20+ museums he's visited, Peter has never come across a summer specimen of a male hooded merganser. Fast forward to the early 2020s. All of us, well, a great many of us anyhow, head out to our local patches, toting a small but serviceable digital camera. We see a merganser and we know we won't get it past the eBird reviewer without a confirmatory photo. So we take pictures, and in the process, we discover cool new things about the summer molt of the hooded merganser. Museum collections are very valuable, of course, but you can't really conduct this sort of study with museum specimens. With a dead bird in a museum tray, you get one shot, literally, and that, as they say, is that. A very fundamental question, namely, how fast do individual birds molt in the wild, was largely unanswerable until the recent proliferation of inexpensive and easy-to-use digital cameras. We're going to move on now to a different bird and a different sort of question when it comes to how fast birds molt. In this case, we're going to take a look at a white-throated sparrow, and we're going to look at it in the winter months as opposed to the summer months. Across much of its winter range, the white-throated sparrow occurs in fair-sized flocks as here. This is one of at least 30 white-throated sparrows in a flock at the edge of a small part of the extreme southern edge of Central Park, which is a problem because it's hard to keep track of all those white-throated sparrows as the winter wears on. Fortunately, in an ironic sense, white-throated sparrows are much less common in winter in Colorado. If one shows up at your feeder in Boulder County, it will likely be the only one of its species throughout the colder months. And we got to study a single bird of known identity all throughout the winter of 2020 to 2021. After the usual expected passage of very small numbers through our area in early October and early November, we were down to just one white-throated sparrow by mid-November. Here's what that bird looked like on November 20th. We had a hunch about the age of the bird, but we wanted to be sure. So we did what anybody does in this day and age. We emailed Peter Pyle, who replied instantly that this is a hatch year or first winter bird. As Peter explained, the primary coverts are worn and brown, contrasting with the replaced formative greater coverts, confirming that the bird was hatched a few months earlier in 2020. We also asked Peter about the generally messed up tail, and Peter reminded us that white-throated sparrows in their first fall should not be replacing their tail feathers in the manner shown by this bird. Perhaps the bird lost a few tail feathers, that happens, and is opportunistically replacing them. We watched the bird regularly, and by mid-January, about a month and a half later, the bird was perhaps a little more worn overall, with its tail feathers looking okay now. Another month and a half elapsed, and the bird was still pretty much the same. One thing to note, though, is that the bird was singing by this date. A day earlier, on February 27th, we heard it singing spontaneously. And that doesn't necessarily make it a male, by the way, for both male and female white-throated sparrows sing, with female song apparently more common in the white morph. Another month elapsed, and the bird was starting to look pretty beat up. And a week later, you had to wonder if the poor bird was about to disintegrate. But less than 2 weeks later, things were starting to look up, despite all the ice and snow and birdseed. And scarcely a week later, the bird was suddenly looking quite spiffy. Moving ahead to May 5th, our white-throated sparrow was sitting pretty as can be in field guide proper posture, a glittering white morph adult. It was singing steadily, and when it wasn't singing, it was giving flight calls like crazy. We conjectured that it was on the verge of migrating away from us that morning, and indeed, we never saw it again. It was fun to watch that bird all winter. Sometimes it seemed like it would take forever for the bird to change. But when it did start to change in April, the process was really quite rapid. I should note in passing that at the exact same time, our flock of first winter Gambel's white-crowned sparrows were also in the process of rapidly acquiring their adult plumage, a transformation which is even more dramatic in that species. Finally, I note that we have a lot more photos than the ones I've just shown you. If somebody with infinite patience wanted to analyze the photos on a nearly day-by-day basis, it would actually be possible. Okay, we've looked now at a hooded merganser and a white-throated sparrow. Our third and final study will be of a red-tailed hawk, a species that can seem almost infinitely variable. But instead of this relatively straightforward red tail, we're going to spend some time with this one. When we saw this bird, we called it a red-tailed hawk based on circumstantial evidence. It appeared to be paired with a red-tailed hawk. In fact, it was at a nest. But then we started to wonder about this bird's ID, and we ran it by the experts, Jerry Lugori, Brian Sullivan, and Tony Luckery. Jerry replied immediately that our photos were of a hybrid between a red-tailed hawk and a ferruginous hawk, and Brian and Tony concurred. In addition to this and other photos, we were also able to extract a recording of the bird's call from a video we made. In particular, we were able to extract a sound spectrogram from the video. The bird's strange call is spectrographically distinct from typical calls of either parental species. That all happened back in mid-April of 2018. We're going to fast forward now to mid-April of 2021. My co-author and I and my brother, Andrew Floyd, whom some of you know, were out INADing when we heard a strange call. We instantly recognized. We looked up, and sure enough, it was a hybrid between a red-tailed hawk and a ferruginous hawk. We were in the exact same spot as 3 years earlier, so we naturally wondered if this could be the same individual. But we had a problem. 3 years had elapsed, and presumably every single feather on this bird had been replaced since our earlier sighting. We had circumstantial evidence on our side. The bird was in the same place, and it sounded the same. We had earlier reached out to who else? Peter Pyle, who had aged the 2018 bird as being in its second or third calendar year, and the bird in 2021 as being an adult. So that lent further credence again of a circumstantial nature to the idea that the bird was the same. But we had something else, a digital smoking gun, and that's the audio from both years. Here's a spectrogram of a subsequent encounter in June of this year, indistinguishable from that of 2018. In the same way that our human fingerprints and retinal scans are largely unchanged through time, so are individual birds' innate calls. F1 hybrids of red-tailed and ferruginous hawks are pretty rare from what we can gather. So how about F2 back crosses? I'm not aware that such birds have ever been documented. Clearly, there is more to learn with these and other birds. With the hooded merganser, for example, we wondered if it bred locally, then molted at our duck pond. Hooded mergansers have started nesting in Colorado recently, and a reasonable next step is to look for more molting birds in Colorado. As fate would have it, we have found 3 more such birds this summer, females in Boulder and Adams counties, plus a male also in Adams County. With the white-throated sparrow, something we're wondering is whether this bird will appear at our feeder in just the next month or so. If so, it will be interesting to compare the temporal progression of wear and molt on the bird in its second winter compared to its first. And back to the hybrid buteo. Did the backcross progeny fledge? If so, what do they look like now? Would we be able to recognize them in the field? I could go on and on like this with many other individual birds, but my time is probably running out. So I'll wrap up by saying that it has been rewarding for me to spend some QT with the same individual bird over extended periods of time. I've learned a lot about how birds change over time, and just as important, how certain things about birds stay the same through time. Before we wrap up, I'd like to thank two people who helped me with my presentation. First, Peter Pio has patiently answered my questions about the birds I've just talked about, as well as other things, for many months now. Also, my co-author, Ted Floyd, who also happens to be my dad, has been behind the scenes all the while. He's literally off camera right now. And speaking of whom, if there's time for questions, my co-author is standing by to help with that. I'll let him field any questions specifically about molts and plumages about which I'm only just beginning to learn. However, if you have questions about our general observations or about our equipment and methods, I'd be happy to field those. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Hannah. That was fantastic. Something that I'm just learning is instead of posting your best, prettiest photos to eBird of a bird, post the ones that show it when it's in molt and at various phases of molt, and that can really help to build up the library of in the Macaulay library of the images of birds at different times of year. Because yeah, I have always had kind of the bias toward get the photo when it looks the nicest. But these were three fantastic examples of how to get different photos along the way. There is one question here. John Dunn wrote, I believe that the first picture in late fall showed no mallard stripe, but most or all later birds did. Could there have been two birds, or perhaps the angle of the photo obscured it? I'm going to guess that he's talking about the white-throated sparrow, maybe.
Yeah. By the way, am I audible?
Yeah.
You
Great.
are.
Thanks. So I'll fill that one. So always possible, and we did have up to 4 birds about a month earlier than that. I thought we pretty carefully compared even the flecking on the black the postocular stripe and right where the supercilium and the postocular stripe come together. We also very carefully compared the primary coverts, photo to photo to photo. So I thought that they were the same bird, but point well taken. And it's certainly important in cases like this to make sure that you have the same bird. So it's a good general point. For what it's worth, we did make an effort to try to compare those images just literally feather by feather as we went along.
That's great. I don't see any other questions, but if people do have questions, please follow up with Hannah and Ted. Their email addresses are in the science program, which is on the agenda online. So Hannah, outstanding job. Thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Yeah, take care. All right, we're gonna move on now. Next up is Ryan Terrill. Ryan grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area birding with his family. He attended college at UC Santa Cruz and received a PhD from Louisiana State University studying the evolution of molt strategies in birds. And he's currently a postdoc. Sorry, Mike. Sorry. He's currently a postdoc at the Moore Lab of Zoology at Occidental College studying avifaunal change over the past 100 years in Mexico. And today, Ryan will be presenting on an interesting migration study that he and others have been conducting. And the title of his talk is 3 Springs and 130,000 Migrating Passerines at Bear Divide. What have we learned so far? So Ryan, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Steve. Can you hear me okay? I can't see anymore,
Yes.
so I'll
Yes,
assume
we
that
can.
it's going well. Thanks so much. I'm just make sure this is optimized for video. And Great. So yeah, so what I'll be talking about today is doesn't quite have to do with my postdoc work, but this is a project that we've now incorporated into the lab. It's something I sort of started doing just before work in the spring, which is watching spring migration at Bear Divide, which is the site kind of near where I live in Los Angeles. This is kind of a video showing what Bear Divide's like. It is tough to see what's going on, but if you kind of squint and look for the dots going by, you can see these are all migrating passerines. Right there. Oof. You see how much is moving through right now?
Oh god. I'm having so much fun looking at those.
We'll just call these passerine spuds because I'm taking a video.
20 warblers flying over.
God, we're like 80.
Yeah. Nashville right by my face.
Wilson's just like tried to murder.
Oh gosh.
Another violet green. Two more tanagers, grosbeak, Wilson's, tanager, Lasley. So hopefully you could see that a little bit at least. But what's going on is there are tons of birds, mostly passerines, a lot of warblers and vireos and some swallows and hummingbirds and stuff flying through this gap during the day. And in fact, we've already had a single day there with almost 14,000 birds in the morning, just going through that little gap that you can see there in the video. Bear Divide seems to be a morning flight spot. Morning flight is a phenomenon that's fairly well known, especially from places in the East Coast like Cape May. And there's a spot in Sweden, Falsbro in Sweden, which is where birds that are primarily considered to be nocturnal migrants continue that migration into the day. The idea for Cape May, at least, is that birds would fly out over the ocean, and then when it got light out, they would realize they were over the ocean and they would turn around and head back to land. And that's sort of currently being rethought. And whether that or not that's happening, or how exactly or why that's happening at Bear Divide, is not necessarily something we understand. But it does seem to be this morning flight or dawn flight phenomenon where birds that are generally nocturnal migrants are flying during the day, and especially during the morning. When we look at where these dawn flight localities are, there's quite a few on the East Coast. There's some in the Central Flyway, like in Louisiana on Lake Pontchartrain, and some in Europe and even Central Asia, but there are very few known from really all around the rim of the Pacific coast. And especially on the Pacific Flyway here in North America, really the only other great site for dawn flight is Butterbrett Spring in Kern County, which is a pretty well-known spot and has had a lot of birds. There was one morning, Sandy Kuntz and Andrew Howe, I think, estimated like 80,000 birds in the morning. So we haven't quite gotten there yet at Bear Divide, but I've spent quite a bit of time at Butterbrett, and just kind of the amount of time I've spent there and the amount of time I've spent at Bear Divide, they seem pretty similar in the amount of birds that come through. So maybe it's just a matter of time until we get that many birds at Bear Divide. But Butterbrett Springs out here in the desert, Bear Divide's actually right next to one of the biggest metropolitan areas in the world. It's right outside of LA, which is nice for me because I can go there before work. So what we kind of think is happening is that birds that are flying north hit the San Gabriel Mountains. And instead of going up the San Gabriel Mountains, these arrows are kind of hypothetical flight paths. Instead of going up and over, they turn and they keep trying to go north. And Bear Divide is really the first low pass that they encounter. And just like Butterbrett, it starts wide at the south and it gets more and more narrow as it goes to the north. And then there's a really small gap. And that's what you saw in the video. We just stand right at that gap and all the birds seem to funnel through there. Of course, a lot of birds probably do go around the kind of the I-5 corridor as well. So what have we been doing there? We spent 2 springs just kind of doing just birding, just sort of doing surveys when we could. And then this last year, we got money from the Pasadena Audubon Society to do standardized counts, which has been pretty fun. So we hired this guy, this counter, Devin Kamerick-Spirick, and we set up a count every day in the spring. And we set up this, we got in touch with this cool software called Dunkadoo, which is what's on that tablet you see there. So we're really trying to optimize data entry because there's so many birds going by. So we have big buttons that are preset. So it's just like Nashville orange crown, yellow warbler Wilson's. You can just kind of hit it as stuff goes by, and that way keep better track. Don't have to look down all the time. Don't have to enter data later. And the cool thing is it logs that live. So it keeps a timestamp for every bird that goes by. And we can broadcast that data. So we set up a website called beardivide.org, where you can check out all our data, you can check out what's going on. And here's a little snippet of like what the Dunkadoo looked like last spring. See all these arrows are birds going by Bear Divide. So this when I recorded it, this was live. So these were just, live updates of birds going by as we're entering them at Bear Divide, which is pretty neat. It was fun actually hiring Devin, because I could on days I couldn't go, I could wake up and have my coffee and just digitally watch birds go by at Bear Divide, which is pretty fun. Here's some other screenshots.
Ryan, I apologize. A couple people are having a little trouble seeing things, and they're wondering if you're able to put it in presentation mode or take it out of.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Is that better?
Nope. It is on my screen. Yes. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't realize. Sorry about that. If we have time, I can go back and show that video again later. But I can show this video. So these arrows are birds going by, and then down here it's counting the birds as they go by. So thanks for letting me know that, Steve. So this is another example of how the live data can look. This is a screenshot from my phone, just on a single day. So you can get a summary of how many species have already gone by, how many individuals, what species, what times. And then you can also explore like the seasonal totals by when they've gone by. Bear Divide is also a really cool spot, I think, for engagement, because even if people haven't birded much, these birds are just like sometimes flying right by your knees and by your waist. Like the birds rarely are above 20 or 30 feet up. So some of these folks are local birders, some were Occidental College avian biology class that we took up there. It's a really cool spot for a lot of times when you take beginners out birding or people who haven't birded, you're like, oh, it's up in the top of the tree up there and they can't see it or whatever. Whereas here you can just stand in a river of birds. It's really cool. And here's another example of kind of what it looks like. So the birds are coming up this mountain here and coming right by. It can be really hard birding. It's hard to identify stuff, but even for beginners, if they're not super worried about identifying everything, it can just be a really enjoyable experience, phenomenon. This is another cool picture I took of birders with this Bullock's oriole zipping over them. Kind of shows what it's like there. I just want to review quickly the couple of things we've learned so far, or some of the stuff we are learning so far. We've had some cool rare birds, like a summer tanager. We've had a blue grosbeak, a few blue grosbeaks. This year we had a rose-breasted grosbeak and a chimney swift, and the best of all was a gray vireo, which was caught in the nets of the Banning Project nearby, which was awesome. There are very few records of spring migrant gray vireos in the state. We've also had this last year was big finch year, which was pretty cool. We had our first Cassin's finch ever this year, and then we had them multiple every day for 3 weeks after that. And so this seemed to be a big finch year. Movements at Bear Divide may be indicative of how big the finch winter has been. And some of the stuff might be local movements like purple finches. We've also seen sex-based migration timing. This is a hard thing to quantify in the field, but I try to take as many pictures as I can. And going and looking through the pictures, we know that males tend to migrate first in the spring. That's not new, but it is something we certainly see at Bear Divide. And it really is noticeable for things that are easy to sex, like Western tanagers and hermit warblers and Townsend's warblers. The males come through for 2 to 3 weeks before the females even start, really. We've seen some cool, weird hybrids and intergrades, like this Audubon's myrtle intergrade, and another one here. And we've actually had quite a few Hermit Townsend's warbler intergrades, which is pretty cool. This is a bird, I've only ever seen them in the fall in California, and maybe only 2 or 3. And we've had either 4 or 5 different ones, all adult males in the spring at Bear Divide, which is pretty cool, like this one. And here's another one that looks a lot like a Townsend's warbler, but you notice there's no yellow on the underparts below the black. And there's not a lot of streaking, and we've had more of this. Also cool things, that we think of as local breeders that are rarely actually seen on migration, like black-chinned sparrow. And we also had lots of birds move by in big numbers that I didn't expect, things that I thought to be local, like band-tailed pigeons, acorn woodpeckers, some of which may be local, some maybe not. Another cool bird that I didn't quite expect to see so many of is phainopepla. And so this study 2 years ago, Dan Baldessari put GPS locators on phainopeplas in LA and found that they were going way out to the desert to breed. Some of them went as far as Chihuahua, New Mexico, and Arizona to breed. And we actually seem to see that movement. So when they were leaving the LA area to go out to the desert to breed again in the monsoon is when they're going through the mountains. And this is mid to late May, we have dozens of phainopeplas going by every day mid to late May. So that's probably what's going on with these birds, which is pretty cool. As far as the man-tailed pigeons, we have a lot of them flying by that seem to be more than could be local birds. When you look at the eBird range map, the northern third of man-tailed pigeons range, they actually leave in the winter. These are all migratory. So are we seeing some birds that are wintering in the Southwest going north as migrants? Maybe that has to do with why we see so many dang man-tailed pigeons flying through there. And Caslin's kingbird, actually, that was one that really surprised me. And especially in March, we get numbers. I've had a day with 20, 25 Caslin's kingbirds, but early in the season, like mid-March. And Caslin's kingbirds, we think of resident here in California, but the whole eastern population that breeds in the pinyon juniper highlands of the desert Southwest, they're all migratory. And so are we getting birds that are from the northern end of the California range, or are they birds that are coming through here and going back out to the desert, or maybe even birds that breed like in southern Nevada, somewhere like that? We don't know, but it's pretty cool they're flying through. I didn't expect to see any Caslin's kingbirds moving through them. The most important thing I think we've learned so far is that the San Gabriel Mountains do appear to be an important corridor for land bird migration along the Pacific Flyway. Not just the fact that we can see it, but we do get tons and tons of birds there. Again, over the first 3 years total, we've had something like 180,000 birds. And so the chaparral and these parts of these mountains are probably an area that we need to think about conserving for migrant land birds. Just going through quickly, kind of when is this going on? When do birds migrate by Bear Divide? Sorry. We look species by species. Every species kind of has an idiosyncratic timing. So you're looking at the date from beginning of the season on the left to the end of the season on the right. And, birds migrate at different times, but you'll notice birds also have different kind of spreads. Some birds are really kind of narrow, like Wilson's warblers. A lot of them come through at one time, whereas yellow-rumped warblers are more spread out. Yellow warblers are more spread out. And when we look at that timing compared to breeding latitude, there's positive association. So birds that breed farther north tend to migrate later, which makes sense, something we already know. In mid-May, when it might be nice and warm and good for breeding here, it's still frozen up in Alaska. And so those birds aren't migrating yet. And also the spread seems to be at least partially explained by width of the breeding range. If one thing I've been looking at recently is what causes daily variation in the number of migrants. Why do we see more and fewer birds? Weather seems to have to do with it, combined with date, like where in migration are we? But that doesn't predict it really well. And one thing I've been thinking about lately is this pool of potential migrants model, where there's kind of a pool of migrants south of us that may be going through. That's influenced by date, and then weather kind of lets them go through Bear Divide. So I simulated a bunch of data based on this model and the data this season. And you do kind of see that where the pool of migrants builds up and then gets released. And that's something we see where if the weather's been really nice for a number of days, it's not just good every day. It's good at first and then tapers off. And also if the weather's been bad for a while and then releases, it's all of a sudden really good. When we compare the simulated data to what we saw this year, it works okay. And it's a much better model than just looking at the weather and the time of day directly. Sorry, time of year directly. So we've learned a few things, still have a whole lot to learn. It's a really cool spot. There's ways you can help out. Go check out beardivide.org. And if the video quality is bad, I'll let Steve tell me. I can show again that video from the beginning if people want to see it. But that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ryan. I was able to see the video fine, but if you're able to make it bigger on the screen and show that video again, I think we definitely have time, and that'll give people a couple minutes to ask questions if they want to post questions.
Great. Let's do it. All right. Right there. Oof. You see how much is moving through right now?
Oh god. I'm having so much fun looking at the hermit
We'll just call these passerine spaz because I'm taking a video.
20 warblers flying over.
God, we're like 80.
Yeah. Nashville right by my face.
Wilson's just like tried to murder.
Laz. Oh gosh.
Another violet green. Two more tanagers, grosbeak, Wilson's, tanager, Lasley.
Great.
It's a pretty cool spot.
Yeah, no, I think that was better. Thank you.
Excellent. Sorry about that.
No. All right, so John Dunn has a comment. Hawk Hill has big flocks of band-tailed pigeons going over in late September. They can be followed as they reach the city. They're migrants, but to where? Perhaps to even south of LA County for some.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion, John. It seems like these birds are going somewhere to the north of us, and whether it's like, you know, they're all resident up to Central Oregon and then just the ones north of there migrate down here for the winter and go back, or the whole population's moving up and down, I don't know. But as you know, as you all know, generally when there's like a gradient in migratory behavior, it is kind of a leapfrog, you know, where the southern ones tend to be resident, and then the farther north you go, the longer distance migrants there are. So if I had to take a stab at it, I would guess that, you know, some of those Washington breeders and BC breeders might be coming all the way down here, but we don't actually know that.
All right, and the question, how did it get its name?
Bear Divide, I actually do not know. There's a fire station there called Bear Divide. There's a picnic area called Bear Divide. I have a big fluffy dog that comes up there and sits with me now. Her name's Ani, so we call her the bear of Bear Divide, but that's not, it's not what it's actually named after. I assume there used to be bears around there. But.
And what's the relationship with weather? More birds with good weather or with bad?
Good, actually. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of what like coastal fall, like the higher pressure it is. Wind doesn't seem to be too much of a factor, but high pressure and temperature. So clear skies and warm temperatures seem to really be the best predictors of migration. Wind kind of is determines how high up they are. If the wind's from the north, they tend to fly really low through the gap. If the wind's from the south, they fly a little higher, but it doesn't seem to affect numbers.
All right, and Phil Unit noted that along the crest of the peninsular ranges in San Diego County, he has more birds in bad weather, foggy or windy, and the bird activity drops to nothing after 9 a.m. So how late in the morning at Bear Divide is there activity?
Yeah, that's something I was going to touch on, is when there's activity and when it starts. But so at Bear Divide, when it's good, sometimes it can go almost until midday. I'd say on the average day, it's pretty dead by 9 or 9:30. But one interesting thing compared to Butterbret, you know, is talking about dawn flight potentially being the continuation of a nocturnal flight. You know, at Butterbret, you get there before dawn and you hear a lot of flight calls and birds coming in and stuff. And as it gets light out, the birds are dropping down. At Bear Divide, when it's still dark out, there's basically nothing moving. You don't hear stuff flying over. There's not stuff high. And then as soon as the sun comes up, the birds start moving through. And it's really different from Butterbret. But yeah, on a really big, really good day, more than 2,000 to 3,000, there will be birds going through till 10:30, 11, 11:30. But on the average day, you know, the average 800 to 1,000 bird day, it's usually more or less over by 9 or 9:30.
All right. And in San Diego, Paul Lehman says, despite the presence of locally nesting cassins at Mount Soledad, we also get what look like some through migrants during April, which would suggest they're California birds rather than Great Basin breeders, given how coastal they are.
It must be. I mean, it makes sense. And we get so few Great Basin breeders, even as vagrants on the coastal slope, you know, just like how rare, even Virginia's warbler is, like, or would be as a spring migrant at Bear Divide. It certainly makes more sense to me that, you know, these might be birds breeding on the northeast edge of their California range.
All right. And another question, the timing seems to mirror Butterbret Springs. And has anyone tried to correlate the timing of pulses at Butterbrett versus Bear Divide?
It's a good question, but I mean, I don't think they're the same individual birds. I think it's a similar phenomenon. Birds at Butterbrett, I think, are coming off the desert, whereas birds at Bear Divide have flown probably over like Orange County and LA. But if you just think, you know, Butterbrett's about maybe 80 miles as the Nashville warbler flies from Bear Divide. And so that's only a couple hours for birds, but actually Butterbrett, the movement is earlier than Bear Divide. So if the birds were going from Bear Divide straight over to Butterbrett, the timing doesn't really make sense. They would either have to stop halfway there or they get there, you know, early afternoon or something like that. So I don't think it's the same individual birds, but I think it is, you know, a lot of the same phenomenon. Is just what side of the San Gabriel and San Bernardino mountains they end up on once they start going north.
All right. And the question, would there be a similar spot in Cajon Pass?
Yeah. Apparently, well, I don't know about Cajon Pass. I think so. I think that there has been some people have been seeing stuff up in Tejon Pass. What's his name? Richard Crosley has been up this year. He like bought a house or 3 in that area and has been seeing a lot of migration up that way too. So there seem to be a bunch of spots where this kind of thing might be going on. But I like Bear Divide because it's so narrow and all the birds come through right in this little area. But it is a thing that I think there are undoubtedly more spots like this. We know there are more spots like this, but more spots that are just as good at this that we could find.
All right. And there's a question. Can you comment on the direction of migration? Can you just clarify that?
Yeah, basically, let me share my screen again. I'll turn off optimize for video clips. So my guess so these red arrows are just sort of my guess, but all the birds we see, or the vast majority of birds, are coming up the canyon from the south, east, you know, and coming through, or the southeast and coming straight up the canyon and then turning north and going up towards like the Tehachapies. So I'm guessing that these birds go up to the Tehachapies and then go up like the west foothills of the Sierra Nevada. That's my guess. But just what we see at Bear Divide is everything's coming through the canyon that same direction.
All right. And lastly, John Dunn has a comment. Most band-tailed pigeons clear out 1 northwest. They get southeast Alaska, warm temperatures and clear are also good for Bay Area sites. Activity largely stops by 9 o'clock. So, all right. Well, Ryan, thanks a lot. Thanks to both Ryan and Hannah for 2 outstanding presentations. We really appreciate it. Hope folks tune in tomorrow at 12:30 for another round of science session presentations. And John Harris will now tell us what's next.
Well, thank you to all our speakers this afternoon. And Steve, we'll be taking a break now until 5 o'clock. Then we'll have our first workshop of the conference, which will be a sound ID workshop given by Nathan Peplow called A Shared Vocabulary for Birdsong. So hope to see many of you there at the workshop. And until then, we're taking a break. Thank you, everybody.